Hello, everyone, and welcome to National Design Month. I'm Vasu Janopoulos, Acting Deputy Director of Education at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Every Thursday in October, we're bringing together our National Design Award winners for conversations in our Design Salon series. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Designing Sustainable Cities. We hope to see you again for other programs throughout the month. And huge thanks to Target for making National Design Month possible, as well as Lower Carbon Capital for supporting the Climate Action Award. I'm very excited to be joined today by the founding principal of dlandstudio, Susannah Drake, whose Sponge Park project received the inaugural National Design Award for Climate Action just last week. Congratulations again, and we look forward to hearing more about Sponge Park soon. If you missed the awards announcement, you can watch it on our YouTube channel, and we'll drop a link to that in our chat. I'm also thrilled to have with us today two of our very dear previous National Design Award winners, Mark Chambers, Architect and Director of Sustainability for the City of New York, where he leads the design and development of policies and programs to enable a resilient, zero-carbon built environment and a fair, healthy future for all New Yorkers. And Susan Szenasy, former publisher, editor-in-chief, and Director of Design Innovation of Metropolis, who will moderate our discussion. As always, we invite you to join the conversation using the chat box. At the end of the hour, we'll open it up for live questions and comments for our winners. Please add those to the Q&A box. Before I turn it over to Susan, Susannah and Mark will share a little bit about their work. Susannah?
So thank you for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to all. I want to give you a little bit of background about my practice and who I am and what I'm doing and what this Sponge Park project is all about. So I am both an architect and a landscape architect and an educator and the founder of a firm in Brooklyn and now in Denver, also called dlandstudio. We're an interdisciplinary practice, and we do a lot of work that is kind of about climate activism, and it relates to infrastructure. And we try to adapt infrastructure systems to make them better for people who live in the communities in which these systems are evident, or which is basically all urban systems. So I wanted to start by sharing my screen and showing you a video of our Sponge Park project, sort of how it works. Now this is an animation, but I think it may explain the sort of big picture really well, and I'll animate as we go. So I'm going to share screen. I'm going to go to my second screen here, and hopefully this will work well. And all right, are you all seeing it? It worked in the practice. Are you seeing the second screen? Just my co-hosts?
Oh, it's it's being recorded, blocks it out, the signage.
The signage.
There's a signage in the middle of it that blocks out your image. It says being recorded. So.
Oh goodness. Okay, so we didn't anticipate that. So you know what I'll do? I'm going to move it back to the first screen.
Susannah, I think it might be okay for the audience.
It's okay? Okay, great.
It's on our end.
Okay, I'm going to press play.
Okay, so I don't
say it. Let us know if in the Q&A it says something different. Let us know. But this is the existing condition of the Sponge Park. There are these planters that don't actually allow any water from the street to get into them because of curbs. So we're removing those and we're putting in these street swales, which do allow water to filtrate in. And then the Sponge Park is made up of a series of bioretention cells. Those are made up of precast concrete and all go together, kind of like Legos, only big ones. And then it has an integrated sidewalk and sedimentation basin. And this filters out all the cigarette butts and all the silt and that kind of thing. And then there's a pedestrian path with an integrated sand filter underneath it, and then a drain. The drain we tied into an existing drain. So when it rains, what happens is the rain comes down the street and some of it goes into the bioswales, but then the rest of the overflow goes into the sedimentation basin. And what that does is it enables distribution into the cells evenly. And then the plants will absorb that and the soil will hold it. And then the water will ultimately go through into a sand filter, particularly if there's more than a 1.2-inch storm. So we're designing it for more than the regulated standards. So the idea is that, you know, this will become this really important piece of infrastructure, sort of nature-based infrastructure, but also that it'll become a public space for the community. We designed this one specifically so that it would provide access for the Gowanus Canal dredgers because they have their boathouse right next door. So we made the paths wide enough to get canoes through, and really wanted this to be as much about the community as it is about creating this piece of green infrastructure. So now, are you seeing the photograph on the screen now too?
Yes, we see the vegetation.
Okay, great, terrific. So this shows the built sponge park, and sometimes of the years it's flowering with really beautiful hibiscus and roses, and other times of the year this is a time when not as many things are blooming. But it's really supposed to be a dynamic space that's very engaging while performing this really important function of cleaning up the water.
Good. Susannah, before Mark goes on, I do have a question for you, Susan here. So
Okay.
what about the Gowanus cleanup itself? I mean, this is amazing. This is really lovely and incredibly sophisticated. But I think that thing was like a cesspool for years and years and years. And what are the programs that are in place to clean it up and on a continuing basis?
Well, it's a very good question. So when we started the project, the area had not been designated an EPA Superfund, which it is now. So in becoming an EPA Superfund, federal regulators came in and dictated what was going to happen, and there was a whole process for cleaning the sediment underneath the canal. But I need to give credit also to the Department of Environmental Protection, because when I started the project, they were in the process of fixing this flushing tunnel that takes water from the East River and sends it through the canal, almost, I don't want, maybe a bad analogy, but like a toilet, like you flush the toilet and the water goes through and it cleans it all out. So that has since been repaired and was reopened before we built the sponge park. So there are actually a series of initiatives that are happening. We also are working on a project, again, with the DEP for water management facility on the northern part of the canal. And that's because of some of the new development that's gone in Brooklyn. That's, you know, because Brooklyn has become so much more popular as a place to live and work. Or it's just the density is increasing. So we're working on a lot of these initiatives, and I feel like there's a really optimistic future. There are also so many wonderful community organizations that have had a huge impact on cleaning up the area and sort of bringing attention to the environment. The Gowanus Canal Conservancy in particular has been my partner through this project, and they're amazing in terms of not just engaging with I mean, I shouldn't say not just, they engage with community or with school groups, they engage with developers to pursue best practices. They're at all of the CAG meetings, which are the community environment or engagement meetings for anything that's happening on the canal, but particularly the Superfund.
That's really great to know. So I think we'll dive into some of the citywide issues on our waterways and the fact that we're on an island and we somehow lost some of the inland waters in many areas of New York. So I'm hoping that we'll get into that. Well, Mark, you're next. What do you have to show us?
All right. First, hi, I'm here. Hey, everybody. Good to see you. Thank you for having me here. And, you know, I'm always happy to kind of join these kinds of conversations. And so it's wonderful to be with such good company. Congratulations again to Susannah on the Sponge Park Award. So I think that one of the things, before I kind of just show a few pictures, and they're more splash photos to kind of give you a sense of the world I exist in. I think it's important to know that architects out there like myself are doing a number of different things to be able to advance the cause, not just of high performance design, but also of policy work. Because I think that one of the things that's always been important to me as an architect is, how do I create an environment where strong, positive, and like impactful design can take place? And for me, that has also moved into a place where I'm constantly working on policy development, and doing that for the largest city in the country has a significant impact, not just here in the 5 boroughs, but also to be able to de-risk a lot of the work that we do for other cities all throughout the country and the globe. And so I'll share my screen because it's my life looks a lot different. It's not as I'm not as looking at as consistently. Let's see what we got here. I'm not as consistently looking at plans the way I once did. Most of the times, you guys can see my screen, I think so. This is last year when we rolled out the Green New Deal for New York City. And what it really is kind of showcasing how do we create these bookends, these boundaries, these places where good design can take place. And at this moment, in this picture, what we're doing is rolling out the beginning of the Climate Mobilization Act, which is landmark legislation that we passed last year to do a number of different things for the city, but the most significant of which is to put a carbon cap on the largest buildings in the city. Most people don't know this, but in New York City, first of all, there's over 1 million buildings here. And on top of that, the lion's share of greenhouse gas emissions that come from heating and cooling those buildings comes from only about 2% of those buildings. So being able to tackle those particular large buildings over 25,000 square feet, and make sure that they are reining in the amount of energy they're using and resources they're responsible for, is really a critical piece of this. So we passed this law which put a cap on these buildings. It goes into effect now. The first compliance date is in 2024, and then 5 years later there'll be an additional compliance date. And buildings that are exceeding that will have to pay a fine. And the fine is commensurate with actually doing the retrofit work that they would need to do anyway. So building owners are incentivized to put the work in, make sure their buildings are operating better, make sure that they are operating as designed, and make sure that they are also creating wonderful interior environments for a lot of the New York City's residents and workforce, to make sure that we're doing the best we can to reduce the impact of a city of 8.5 million people. And it's not all smiles like this. There's a lot of hard work that goes behind this, a lot of wrangling of different interest groups. And my work and my job has a lot to do with putting together a team of folks that can really tackle many different complex concerns, issues, and constituents to make sure that we're doing the best we can for everyone. I mean, one of the key, I think, obstacles around this particular law is the fact that we didn't want building owners to be able to do the work in their building and pass all that cost on to tenants. And then, we already have a hard problem with people being able to afford rent in the city. So being able to make sure that we carved out places in which we had a different set of requirements for buildings that had rent regulated units, that was a key part to make sure we're protecting New Yorkers while still advancing the work we can do in the city. I'll show another pic. Let's see if this will come up. There we
So
go.
the carbon caps are, I'm hoping that they're on those massive, colossal glass towers that went up in the last 5 years, because they are like obscenely big and dense and really just really nauseating, actually. I'm being honest here. So,
well, I mean, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and actually, the mayor said a lot at that exact event. The mayor said a lot about being able to put some level of kind of control on some of these glass skyscrapers. And I think, from my point of view, look, I know that there are tons of different materials that can perform in many ways, and I think that, I'll be honest, I think we've gotten a little bit lazy in terms of being able to fully just go with curtain wall, and not think about the ways to use different glass and mass ratios, look at high performance, or even use glass that is extremely high performing in the triple pane glass and so forth. I think we can do better. And so I think that's the lesson here, is that it's and performance matters. It's not just about the intent of the design. Is it performing? And if it's not performing, it is not actually doing what it needs to do to kind of protect the inhabitants of those buildings. And we're seeing a lot more about the impact if we don't do this. So here's another image down the street from our office, which showcases the climate march in New York City, where many, like thousands upon thousands of people kind of gathering in the streets to showcase the fact that if we don't act, there are going to be consequences. And I think that level of disruption is a message, not just to, city workers, politicians, but it's a message to designers and to a lot of other professionals that we have to bend our skill sets towards this end. And it's not optional any longer. There's no room on the sidelines. All of us have to be taking our skill sets, our passion, and our ability to be creative problem solvers and bending them towards climate solutions, or we are just kind of pretending that we're not going to be impacted by this. And we've learned everything over the last 8 months, pretending something does not exist does not mean that it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So we need to absolutely take this seriously and make sure that we are doing our part. And our part is, I think, incredibly valuable and needed at this time.
So the carbon cap is it just about saving on carbon output with existing systems, or is there like a non-fossil fuel type of energy involved in all of the buildings that you're carbon capping? Because I think I'm not seeing that from the actual building, so I don't know what they're doing. I thought they'd have more solar. I thought they would have more geothermal, but I don't know, do they? So let's talk a little bit about what the alternative energy sources are for this carbon capping goal.
Yeah. So, I mean, think about it in two different ways. There's supply and demand, right? So the supply side is really one of the big critical parts. How do we get our power, our energy, our electricity here in New York City? For the most part, the lion's share of electricity that comes from the city comes from upstate, right? It's also, if you think of it as like a highway of electricity that's coming down, there are kind of choke points and little bridges in which that highway gets into New York City. And there are limits on how much can move over top of those highways at a time. So we have to think about this not just in terms of what we are doing right now and how new renewables and things that are coming online upstate are getting to us, but the fact that we're going to need more. We don't have enough of it as it is right now. So that's offshore wind, that's hydropower, and that's solar, the way you described. And also keep in mind, the more that gets developed, that cleans the grid and makes it easier for all the buildings to be compliant, because ultimately we want all of the power they're using to be renewable. But until that happens, and until the offshore wind market increases and it's starting to become a thing, buildings are going to have to invest in retrofitting and reducing demand. And that's for the majority of buildings that are within the kind of a range close to the cap. It's really operational changes. It's turning things off when you're not using them. It's taking all the design that went in through all of the systems that many of the people in this call put together and like carefully kind of scripted to have these buildings that have these high performance capacities, and actually using them and making sure that they're doing something that is really thoughtful for how the occupants really exist in the space, and fine tuning that. And other buildings are going to have to retrofit and put in new windows and fix insulation. And we've also pushed out what's something called PACE financing, which means that building owners will be able to take out low interest long-term loans that are commensurate with the type of work that they need to do, like the payback timeline. So if you're changing out your windows and it's going to take you 7 years to pay back the cost that based on the energy savings, then the loan's going to be for 7 years. And you also pay it back through your property taxes. So it makes it easier for building owners to have that debt live with the property and not the owner. And then they're able to pay it back over the course of the time based on the energy savings. So it's just a really much more thoughtful way for building owners that don't have money on hand to be able to do this kind of work. And it also is going to put a lot of architects and designers and contractors, I think, back to work after a slow period of this last 8 months.
So what's the aim? What are the years that you're shooting for in order to achieve this carbon capping and the retrofitting?
So we put this in place where between now and 2030, the goal is to put these strict carbon caps in place for the largest buildings. Between that and a few other different policies. At the same time, we also rolled out a policy, which many of you are probably seeing already. If you go to Department of Buildings in New York City now and you're applying for a permit that includes you doing a new roof, that roof has to have solar or a green roof on it, or a combination of both. So that's law now in the city. That was another rollout at the time. Those are pieces that help this this move forward. But well, in the next 10 years, the goal is to get as much as we can out of these buildings, and then develop the plan going forward. That strategy will kind of dramatically cut probably around 40% or so of the emissions that we need to get to out of these buildings. And then we draft a course from that point on to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. So all the big game is all in 2050. We're no longer reliant on significant kind of fossil fuels to be able to heat and cool our buildings. But right now, the critical part is between the next 10 years. That's when the fight is. The fight is now. And it's not just locally, it's nationally. Like what happens in the next 10 years will really determine our future.
So just in case there are, everybody isn't an architect listening to this, can you define carbon capping?
Got it, yes. So if you think about it like this, for every bit of electricity that you use in your building, or every bit of natural gas that you turn on for the fire for a furnace, all of those things, they are created through processes that emit greenhouse gas, have greenhouse gas emissions. So you're burning something somewhere, right? And that has an impact overall on our ability to resist climate change. We're putting too many emissions out into the atmosphere. So when we say a cap, means that we need to bring that number in, and we look at buildings across similar typologies and be able to look at the performance over decades and a lot of information that we have from benchmarking. And we can say that a high performance building of this type, this building occupancy should be performing right in this range. And then we set the line there, and everyone above it has to get below it.
Okay, so going from the energy supplies, which is really very encouraging. So I'm hoping that there's really strong enforcement programs in place so that people have to live up to their promises. And
yeah, it'll be me knocking on your door.
Okay, good. But it's really, really important. And I think people understand that, correct? I mean, I think there's a kind of inner driving force there, and not just, yeah, let's make more money and let's get out and let's move on. But I think that we really need to have that kind of thinking by building owners, by developers, by architects, by residents, by everybody, to say that this is an important thing for all of us.
Absolutely. I mean, now make no mistakes, there are many that resisted laws like this, will continue to do so. I think that we have to be consistent. We have to also make sure that we are not letting those voices be too loud. I think that's so. Yes, there's a lot of consistency around people thinking and acting, but don't kind of underestimate what it is, what invested interests and power that allow for a lot of decision making to be in support of fossil fuel companies. Like it's still going to be a fight.
So we have these regular podcasts on things like energy producing companies, like Con Edison, are really beholden and really friends of the fossil fuel industry. And how are the New York State energy companies on this? I know that Con Ed just had me sign up for solar possibilities. So how are these companies working in order to get to that level that you want people to get to in 10 years?
Well, I mean, you have to think about the fact that it's not just, I mean, a lot of these companies sell a product, right? So like if you need natural gas to fuel your furnace or your stove, that's a product that companies sell to you. What it's important for us is to understand that there are alternatives, and those alternatives drive demand. So if we start to think about, hey, maybe it's better for me to have an induction stovetop that is more efficient and uses electricity electricity is a little bit easier to control the ability for it to be renewable, then that's a better way forward. But it's also, I want to make sure that I'm not making it seem as though everything is easy, because we need to change the demand structure. We need to make sure that more people are having options that have less impact on our environment. But we also need to realize that electricity is more expensive than natural gas. And so it's not just a matter of switching over immediately and everything is fine. Like, we have to be in a place where we are also supporting all of the residents of all of our cities to be able to make that transition in a way that they can afford to do so. And that has a lot to do with pushing back against the fossil fuel companies and developing better city and state policies to be able to socialize more of the cost of this transition.
So one last question about this energy business, because I want to get to the ecology part of what we're talking about. So what is it? I mean, I just think that it probably costs more in terms of not just reclaiming, but refining and cleaning up after pollution. And when you cost account for everything for the energy sources, the solar energy is probably really cheap compared to what fossil fuel costs. Do you guys have figures on those and think about how the alternative is a better, not just healthier, not just probably safer, cleaner, much more to what the earth it can produce for us, with us? And so how is that being treated? Because it's being treated as some outlier who's like, it's going to be just as expensive, and why would you want to do that when we have this great gloop in the middle of the earth that we can siphon out? So what's the conversation at your level about these energy sources?
Sure. So I think one of the important things is that we're in a transition period, as I said before. And the conversation involves acting quickly, but it also involves demystifying some of the difficulty with some of these changes for a lot of people. And for us, of course, it's more expensive to be able to wait and to not act. I mean, we're seeing how much it costs to deal with the kind of scourge of extreme heat that we're seeing, not just in urban environments, but also as it impacts the fires raging out in West. Like, all of that are costs associated with inaction, right? What does that look like when we look at the stream of storms that are coming in the Gulf presently? Like, these things have costs and the outcomes are significant. But we've also been saying this for quite some time, and it's still true. I think where we see there being changes is in other industries, and this is why this conversation is so important, is that different industries are starting to recognize they too have a voice in this, and that voice matters. The financial industry is starting to say, hey, if we wait too long, it's going to be really expensive for us to transition when people are acting chaotic, and that chaos is not good for business. So we need to start doing a better job of analyzing climate risk, and that same thing goes for designers. I think that, people are able to go to Susannah's park and see exactly what it looks like in action to be able to take aggressive measures that also have a benefit to life and lifestyles within an urban environment. What that does is that it normalizes this behavior, and it makes it very easily understandable for people to be like, we can actually do multiple things at the same time, and it's not just either or. And we can also just like improve when we are having interdisciplinary solutions to problems that are urgent. And I think that's going to be the lesson, is like, are we growing the tent? Are we bringing more people in? And are we having examples they can point to and see and experience and touch and be able to say, hey, this is an example of how I can also bend my industry towards this collective species level effort.
So I actually have a comment related to this, Susan. Just one second. I'm
going to get to this, and then I have you right in mind. So don't feel neglected. I am there with you. But Mark, so you have you mentioned the financial industry, which is, very much located in New York or headquartered in New York a lot, and obviously it's everywhere. But is anybody from the financial business on your advisory board? And if not, why not? And because I think there's some really interesting people on your advisory board, but then I missed something on public health. I missed the financial business being part of it. So how is that? How are you broadening that advisory board's connection with your organization?
Absolutely. So I think it's also, keep in mind, we have multiple advisory boards. One of the things that's a great part about working for New York City is that we are a magnet for a great level of engagement from industry leaders. And so we have a program that's called One NYC, which is the vision for New York City over the next several decades. That has an advisory board that has tons of folks both on financial, design, economics, like all the different parts that play a role into our city, environmental justice. But we also have advisors that kind of help on a number of other things. You mentioned the finance side, but it's also tons of impacts that relate to how this work will impact air quality, how that air quality will have a kind of positive and negative impact on comorbidity and other issues that relate to what New Yorkers are experiencing right now. So the breadth of impact and influence is large, but I think the measure that I'm particularly encouraged by is that even outside of the folks that we are collecting and bringing in to advise us, we're seeing these major entities, drivers, even in the finance world, that are creating entire new funds and new market products associated directly with mitigating climate risk and finding ways to have environmental and social governance as a huge part of their bottom line. And I think that's it's an outcome that is really starting to determine how industries are also pivoting. And I think that's going to be an important thing to watch.
So I'm sort of hoping that the advisory boards and all the people that the city works with is much less Brooks Brothers and a little bit of female and Black and Asian and representing the city of New York and its various talents. Is that being talked about? Because I mean, I think not represented peoples can create have some really horrible problems.
100%. I mean, one of the things that Mayor de Blasio said when he first came into office and has led with that example, and one of the reasons why I agreed to come and work for this team is the fact that he said publicly from the beginning, an administration should look like the population it serves. And I think that is something that is also incredibly important to recognize, that yes, there are a lot of different components we can get into around how representation matters, whether it is gender representation, whether it is racial representation, disability representation. All of those things matter. They make better policy determinants. They make better work environments, but you have to say it. You have to put it out there, and you have to build your teams accordingly. I think that's something that has been and will continue to be a legacy of this administration and others, as an example of saying that, like, you can't just want it to happen. You actually have to put it in practice to make sure that we're doing the part that we can to be able to change some of the kind of visuals as well as the outcomes based on having a much more diverse representation on the policies and that kind of represent our values.
Well, I mean, just what we have learned from the pandemic and how communities that are basically ignored or misplaced or placed next to sewage and all kinds of pollutants and not good enough schools and not the right policing. I mean, it's a major issue that has been revealed during these times, and I don't know how any city, including New York City, can get away from addressing those. And it's not going to be palliatives, but it's going to be some real change. I'm hoping that we're going to see that. But one of the things that I want to get to, Susannah, because I think I want also to talk about urban ecology, because I think it's really important for us to think about what the natural world, even though we paved it over to a dramatic extent, but then we really have to consider that we are an island area which depends a great deal on its natural surroundings and its natural and its location on the map and its location to the rays of the sun. And so Susannah, you have double training in architecture and landscape. So how do we begin to have a conversation about urban ecology in these places, in policymaking positions, in planning, in development, in all of those things that we have going on, all those skills that build the city, but basically until now have kind of touched at the edges. But I mean, I see a lot of little planters in 50-foot skyscraper little parks. So I mean, I just think that it's ecology is missing mostly in every place. So can we talk a little bit about that here?
Sure. I think Anne Whiston Spurn maybe put it most poetically. There's I think it was her acceptance speech for the Jeffrey Jellicoe Award, where she talked about walking down the street and then finding a hole, and that there was this, strange hole in the road, and she looked down and there was water, and she saw that and she said, why is there water? And I think one of the realizations was that, we have these cities, and there were these natural systems that existed, and we filled in swamps and we paved over natural landscapes, and, for the sake of industry. I'm not being anti-urban here, but I think that the issue that we face now is that, given the trajectory of climate change, and the severity of storms that's happening, some of those natural systems are kind of wanting to come back, and they're wanting to reemerge. And we saw that with Hurricane Sandy, and actually one of the questions was about Hurricane Sandy, so I'll loop that back into this. But we saw with Hurricane Sandy that the water that came in at storm went back to the line of the 1624 water line. And we had mapped this as part of our project, working with ARO on an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art called Rising Currents. And we'd shown that that's where the water's going to go, and that's where it went. And it was really thinking about these subgrade hydrologic systems, or the geologic systems, or the natural systems that made the land, and recognizing that one, they may come back, but two, that there's opportunity to kind of change the nature of the urban ground in those areas, right? So we need to design differently for those zones. And someone asked me about in the Q&A about the Sponge Park and how we'd respond to a next Sandy. We designed it so that it could take periodic inundation from a big storm like Sandy. It's designed with plants that can manage that on an occasional basis. It's not designed with plants that can handle salinity all the time. So, there will need to be a longer term strategy for how these sponge parks kind of migrate up the street, but there'll also have to be a strategy for how buildings don't exist in those zones as well. So, it's kind of a bigger issue of sea level rise. So, but ultimately, we are going to have to think about that and design a new future.
So, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about pervious pavers and somehow that allow the water to seep into the ground. I mean, I see a lot of repavement in my neighborhoods downtown, and I can tell you it's not pervious. So,
No, oh, sorry, go ahead.
but I just think that we know a lot more about these construction methods and construction materials than we did before, and yet we keep going at the same thing and dealing with the same solution. So maybe Mark can pipe in on this, on the city's look at some of the alternatives to the heavy concrete that blocks out every drop of water and doesn't allow anything to seep through.
Right. I mean, I think there's two sides of this that I think about. I think about interventions like Susannah's that start to kind of take the existing framework of impervious pavement infrastructure, channel it in a way in which it becomes a kind of positive use and outcome. I also think about the fact that the reason why it becomes difficult to do that is because all of those paved spaces are predominantly occupied by cars. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that's really where the challenge is. How do we reclaim space that is identified and utilized for just for vehicles? And so one thing that happened over the summer also during COVID is that we've opened 65 miles of city streets for not for cars, for pedestrian access, mainly so that people can socially distance with a certain level of additional space to do so. I would love to see the majority or a lot of that stay open. I mean, I think that we have the ability to have a conversation now about the role and the place of the kind of public domain, and what does that look like when it's not only dominated by cars, and maybe there's an in between. I think that gives us a framework to start to have different conversations about pervious and impervious space and which things are more appropriate. Because if it's only for cars, then you're going to make decisions that are in service of those vehicles, as opposed to making decisions that might be in service of other outcomes and ones that have us be a kind of a healthier environment that can, breathe a little bit more effectively or utilize water and let it infiltrate more effectively.
We may also want to think about the sort of the qualities of the materials. Like, yes, we can use more permeable paving. That would be wonderful. That was, again, one of the premises of our Rising Currents project. But I think also thinking about albedo, and in the last mayoral administration, they had this light roof initiative to lighten the roofs to reduce heat gain. And I'm so thrilled that the de Blasio administration is calling for green roofs, and because that is an extra step and it improves the evapotranspiration and the cooling. But our roads are still made of black asphalt, and that's a heat gain. And I think 26% of the city is paved. So as we make these transformations of giving this space over to the public, I think the idea of recoating them or making them out of other materials that are a lighter color would also be an additional benefit. So there's permeability and there's color. So heat gain and water absorption, and it all has to kind of go together to make a strong urban ecological system.
Could you explain what albedo is?
Yes. Albedo is the reflectivity. Sorry, my father was a geophysicist, so I talk in probably abstract ways, but or scientific ways. But albedo is the reflectivity of a surface. So if you step on a really light colored surface, it feels cool. Like on a hot summer day, light colored surface feels cool. Hot surface, you could fry an egg, right? Really hot. And I've done experiments with this. We did a project down at before the Brooklyn Bridge Park, Michael Van Valkenburg's masterpiece went in. We did a pop-up park there, and we coated the surfaces with a lighter colored material for this pop-up, and it made it habitable in the summer, when other areas of the city where you had black asphalt were just uninhabitable. They were just plain too hot. So.
Yeah. And also, I'll add one additional thing around when it comes to what Susannah is talking about the the impact of those color choices is that, you know, heat is an incredibly pernicious killer. Like heat and across cities all across the country and globally is responsible for, you know, killing more people than a lot of the natural disasters that we talk about. And that's every year. It's constantly causing problems, and we get hotter and hotter. And this summer, of course, is the hottest summer on record. So keeping those decisions have real impacts that often lead to loss of life. And I think it's important for us to make sure that we're considering the stakes are high. So a lot of the options and places that we look to have interventions need to also kind of recognize that if we don't do that, there are costs to that. And those costs are often borne by people that are the least able to withstand them and are least resilient. So our vulnerable populations all throughout cities are kind of the frontline communities that have to deal with things like extreme heat.
So what about, I mean, there was a time when Chicago, for instance, was installing a lot of green roofs. And there were some really interesting green roofs, whether they brought in the prairie or grew vegetables or grew corn or whatever it was. There were a lot of them popping up. What about in New York? What's going on with the possibilities of green roofs? I mean, there was a really nice little farm up there in Brooklyn. What's happening to those, and how is that being thought about as part of this kind of nature cooling, reconfiguring movement?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I mentioned before, you know, what we usually talk about our local laws and the number that they were passed. So local law 92 and 94 are the laws that relate to requiring whenever you do a new roof, there has to be now a vegetated roof. That will dramatically change a lot of the roof landscape throughout the city. But I think it's a policy lever when there are other ways we should also be thinking about this. I think the notion of, you know, ecological design as being as integral to a design outcome as some of the materiality of choices of buildings or you know, the positive and negative spaces that we're responsible for. I think the lesson here is that we should be incorporating more of it into our cities, whether it is, again, at street level, within buildings, at different levels within buildings. We have great examples of massive green roofs in the city. Javits Center, for example, is an incredible green roof to go visit. But you know, most of our buildings in the city are tall buildings with small tops. So it's not necessarily going in aggregate. It'll be a huge a game changer, but we should also be looking at how can we, again, reclaim more space to be able to increase the ability for us to get the benefits of more infiltration and also the reductions in urban heat that leads to.
Are you looking at the outer boroughs where there are more industrial buildings and larger land hugging buildings? That means larger roofs, because there's possibilities there for some food supply supplements. I mean, you know, New York State has some really good small farms that can pretty much supply the city. We don't have to go to Kansas for beef or some of this. So I mean, I think this idea of the city getting closer to its region and getting closer to the resources is what's the plan in that? What kind of overview is that being talked about? That because again, the cost accounting. You know, the fact that you pay for the transportation, the packaging, the all of that business that goes with this massive movement of material all over the place. So how is that being talked about in terms of the city and our health? I mean, healthier, fresher things available.
I think we should be thinking about this in terms of demand, right? So I mean, you know, there are over 1 billion cows on the planet being fed and being, you know, and water's contributing towards them being kept alive, and it's having a dramatic impact on our ability to sustain. But that's because people demand that. People are it. So I think less about necessarily. There's definite parts about making sure we want to be supplying food closer to the places in which we are are using them. So like, absolutely, I'm supportive of the ways in which we can bring some of those loops closer to where people are consuming. But we also have to just have a real honest question about some of the choices that we make and what are the impacts of those choices. And I think for a country that has a very kind of meat-centric methodology with a lot of the choices that we make, that has consequences. And so I'm really concerned with, let's get at the core of some of the decision making and why we're making those decisions and what are the true impacts, getting that information out so people can make informed decisions. And then subsequently, I also want there to be lots of examples of alternate options within reach, within eyesight, so that people can recognize that there are different ways to do this. There's also different technologies to do that. So it's not just that it has to be grazing land, or land where we are farming in a traditional sense. Hydroponics have come a long way to be able to, produce leafy vegetables, for example, at a fraction of the real estate space. So there's ways to do this that I think are much more in line with where we are and where we need to be going.
So, Susannah, in your studies of the built environment and the natural environment together, what areas in New York are you studying? Are you looking at? Are you thinking about how it could be the two things, the built and the natural, could be brought together in a much more seamless way, in a really interesting, beautiful way that will also remind us that we're part of something bigger than ourselves and not just our little apartments hidden away in some large building. So what are you looking at?
Well, I might actually have a good segue that talks about, or that refers to your question and also what Mark was just talking about in terms of local agriculture, because a few years ago, we developed a vertical farm for the Milan Expo. And we were working with Jim Bieber's office and created this vertical farm that was about the size of a football field. It was huge. And it wasn't quite a hydroponic system, but it was water-based and had these sort of tubes that would produce food. They're called zip towers, and they were developed by an agronomist out at the University of Wyoming. His name is Nate Story, and he had a company called Bright Agrotech, or has a company. And in any case, this technology is modular and really easy to deploy, and deployable on these vertical walls. So you were talking about the sort of the glass towers recently, or in the beginning of the presentation. Why not make a sort of an interstitial layer that is a productive agricultural layer, like these kind of greenhouse walls that are internal, or deploy this on the outside of buildings during the growing season. And then the armature that's there for the rest of the year is also something that could be really beautiful as a facade if treated well, or if detailed well by the architectural community. So I think there are those kind of opportunities that make green space not only available for absorbing water or for evapotranspiration or for cooling the city or filtering the water like the sponge park, but also providing food. And I think that could be a really important amenity for communities that are in food deserts, which tend to be a lot of the underserved communities that are impacted by infrastructure. You could even take infrastructure systems and start to adapt them with these agricultural systems. So, I wholeheartedly believe in this idea of this local architecture and, local agriculture, and think that it's something that could really be developed in much more detail.
Well, actually, it's also local architecture, because every building doesn't fit everywhere. And so the climate has to do with the heat, the cold, the rain conditions. I mean, it's such a regional kind of a thing. But one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is we've had, like the project you mentioned in Milan. I mean, these things are kind of one-off. It happens. It's a great idea. It's a great idea to build on. And I've been watching architecture for like forever, and there isn't that much built on some of these great ideas. And one of the things that everybody seems to forget, although they're all practicing a kind of late day modernism, but modernism had to reinvent the world. I mean, they came into a brick and mortar world that then they had to reinvent. I mean, as one early modernist architect told me once, we had to invent everything. And so, we are at that stage where I think we really have to start reinventing in order for it to work for the earth, for people, for equity, for all of those things that we're talking about that come into the conversation now stronger than ever. So Mark, let's start with you on this. How do we begin to encourage the architecture community, and more than that, the development community, to pay more attention to these issues of innovation in architecture, in how it's built, and the kind of connectivity between nature and architecture? And it's not some old-fashioned idea. It's not about, the old Victorian house, but it's about a new idea about the buildings that we make, and how to improve them, and how to invent a new way of connecting.
Well, I think that we have to recognize that for the majority of architects, a lot of the decision making is based on who is your client, right? And what do they want, and how are they, what service are you providing to them? And so that's a constraint that is always challenging. And I don't think it's something that should be overlooked, because it's a reality of being able to add value to any project. But I do think that the time for architects to be activists is upon us. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to beat your clients up into a corner every minute and make sure that they are doing what you want them to do. But I do think there's an idea of being able to try to hold people more accountable, and try to make sure that you're putting your attention and, again, your unique skill set towards an outcome that actually creates an environment where more of the design that we're advocating for can take place. So what that means to me is that architects as a voice need to show up more, and showing up more means showing up at city council hearings, and showing up in protests, and showing up when people are writing energy codes and building codes, and signing up to be part of those organizations, those committees. Those are the places in which a lot of the frameworks are decided, that then will create more opportunity for the design to be able to flourish within those constraints. And so I think that I don't want to be I don't want to kind of make it seem as though this is just a matter of desire, but I think that it's a matter of architects are going to have to be more vocal, and they're going to have to make sure that they are using every lever they can to be able to be advocates for the changes that we need to see happen. And I think that individual action will kind of lead to a lot more collective action that will be ultimately necessary for what needs to happen. Same thing, I think, as it applies to states and cities and states and kind of the federal government. Like, we can only do so much at a city level. We need the federal government to be able to make these large systemic changes. And part of that comes from individually making sure that we are being activist cities, and we're pushing this forward in whatever way we can.
So Susannah, on Sponge Park, you had a really interesting collaboration with not just the city, but the people who live near the canal and the
Mhm.
neighborhoods that they inhabit. And so you got to know a lot of the people and a lot of the needs and a lot of the issues. How did you do the kind of outreach that I think now every designer, every architect has to be practicing? Because what's your method of connecting? Because I think your work probably was of course it was shaped by your design ideas, but it was shaped by what you heard and what you saw and what people were hoping for.
Well, the whole process was kind of unusual, let's just say, because when I started my firm, I wanted to work on large scale infrastructure systems in the city. And as a small women-owned business, I knew I wouldn't be able to touch that. And I also thought, okay, I have some really big ideas. How am I going to get them out there? And, I needed a way to support that. So I applied for grants from the New York State Council on the Arts to fund some of those initial ideas. And a community group saw that. The Gowanus Canal Conservancy actually saw some of the work that I had done through the NISCA grant working on the BQE. And they said, hey, that's interesting. Can you help us? And so I said, hey, yeah, I'd love to. Let's apply for a grant together. And so we applied for another NISCA grant to do the initial work. And then when the economy tanked in 2008, and I had my little young fledgling firm, I discovered some other grants. The next one was from the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, and that provided money to do a first prototype project. And so all of this time we were working outside of the public agencies, and we were doing that in order to enable innovation. And I totally understand where people and agencies are coming from, because you work with standards and you aren't really rewarded for innovation, and experimentation is not really something that you should undertake with public dollars necessarily. I say that kind of loosely, but what happened was the development of this pilot project enabled innovation to happen and enabled the DEP and the public agencies to have some cover, because I was doing it, and I was doing it with a community organization. And so, there was obviously support from the community organization, but also really no risk on their part. If it failed, it was all on us, right?
So firstly, what is NISCA?
The New York State Council on the Arts. Sorry, I thought I said that. And then NWIPC is New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission.
So there are these public organizations or privately funded, some of them are private organizations, that are looking for innovation, looking for ideas, looking for projects that they would lend money to or give money to. So I mean, there are funds available. I don't think that my old modernist friend who said we had to invent everything, he wasn't working for government. He was working for clients who were looking for new solutions, because modernism promised a whole new way of living and a kind of freeing up from all of the old systems. So are we there with this newly environmentally aware, socially connected, empathetic movement that we're experiencing, that we can say that there's more possibilities for this kind of innovation, that kind of reinventing modern architecture for the needs of an environmentally safe and healthy planet? I mean, Mark, you first, and then Susannah.
I think that this all requires disruption, and that is really the part of the lessons that, as I mentioned before, when we were talking about the youth climate movement, you have generation of younger people that are not as burdened by some of the bad decision making that we have, but are going to have to deal with the outcomes of it. Right. So it's like, whereas you have a generation of people that may not be, may not be as accustomed to driving cars, for example, but are dealing with the outcome of air pollution, the outcome of fossil fuel usage. And so those things are there's a different dynamic, I think, at play. And I also feel like they are very good at being kind of unapologetic about their critique. And I think that's important too, because the situation is incredibly complex, and also very dire if we don't make strong decisions. So I'm really excited about the disruption that's been coming, because it's forcing all of us out of our comfort zones and putting us into a place where, you know, we are going to have to respond accordingly, or there will be consequences. Those consequences might be that our roads get shut down, and people are in the streets, and people are showcasing, like, you know, how they feel, and demanding change. And I think that's the way it should be.
So power to the people. Good. So Susannah, this question, and then I have a feeling that we're ready for the audience questions.
Well, you know, I teach ecology and design at CU Boulder, and one of my students asked me, you know, why haven't we seen more change in the last 50 years? And earlier in the week, we were looking at Ian McHarg's work, and you know, his development of this kind of layered way of looking at the landscape that starts to integrate urban and ecological systems. And I think it's a little frustrating that we haven't seen more progress in the last 50 years. I mean, in my entire lifetime, we haven't seen more progress. I mean, I've been thinking about these things since I was a little kid. I'm hoping that we're at a tipping point because of sort of the impacts of that climate is having on cities, and the impact of events like COVID, because we know that the technology exists, and there just has to be the will. And I think, you know, with our Sponge Park project, the idea of it is as much as is of as much importance as kind of the reality of this smaller project in Gowanus. And I think the idea that you might be able to, you know, subvert the systems, but also create something that systems can use, that cities can use to make a better future is huge. I think the other element that we haven't really covered in this is that, you know, there are a lot of private companies that have a lot of space that could use some of this technology. Like, you know, we talked about, or we've looked at adaptation of our Sponge Park idea for highways, but we've also looked at it for large warehouse spaces. You know, we have to be thinking about the applications of our best strategies and our best technology across all industries. So, you know, it's very easy for us to say, oh, the city should be doing this, oh, the federal government should be doing this. But yeah, what about, you know, all of the enormous companies that also control a tremendous amount of the wealth in this country? You know, Amazon. I mean, I hate to pick on them, but, you know, hey, there are a lot of warehouses out there. There's a lot of cooling happening. There's a lot of potential positive action that could happen if a few of those companies came together and started to become partners in this change.
Well, and I'm, you know, Mark, that you're kind of, you're probably more in touch with the development and the political community than any one of us here. So, I mean, where do you see some openings? Because I think if we go back to the same way of developing, of building, of city planning, of policy, and that scares me to death, because if we do that, we are gone. I mean, the earth is gone and we're gone with it. Mm-hmm. So how do you see some opening somewhere in your various conversations about are they looking at total costs of something? Is the healthcare counted into the total cost of building somewhere? Is the school system that is not working because it's not getting funding, getting computed into how that community gets developed and built? I mean, we know this, we hear this, but we're not doing anything about it so far. So how are you seeing some inroads in this from your various connections?
So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think just to pick a few pieces of that, and also kind of dovetail off of what Susannah said, I think that it's important to hold people accountable, right? And I think it's also important to recognize that the kind of power structure of those making decisions around, especially on the private sector side. So these large companies that could do so much more and consistently change the narrative around what success looks like and what the future should look like. They are not going to do so necessarily on their own accord. There's a certain amount of recognition that they're going to have to be forced to do this. And there's often a narrative, it's the same thing that goes with recycling, is that it's always thought of, it's like, oh, well, it's only about the kind of individual person. And if you're not recycling that one can, then you are single-handedly responsible for the entire climate crisis. And the reality is that we shouldn't have you shouldn't be getting materials and choices and bottles and cans that aren't recyclable. And in addition to that, it should be effortless for you to be able to make those into a closed loop system. And I think that comes back to holding manufacturers, private sector companies responsible for the lifetime use of the products that they produce. So if they produce something, they should take it back at the end of use, and it should be able to be reincorporated into new products. That closed loop system, that ability for us to kind of move out of designing for obsolescence, like that's something that organizations and companies are going to have to be forced to do. And it's something that they are going to have the largest impact on a lot of the changes that we're looking for, but we have to hold them accountable. And that happens hopefully it happens from the point of view of us working and policies and those things getting supported. But it also has to be from the public sector, from the private sector, of massive movements of people pushing on those companies to change. And I think that's part of the responsibility of people watching, is to find communities, no matter where you are, what is your community. That community needs to have a voice. And that's when I kind of come back to the idea that everyone needs to move towards being activists right now. That's what we need in order to push these organizations to change.
Well, one of my last question, and then we need to open it up to questions from the audience. So the way modernism took hold was that there were these key firms like Seagram's, who hired these brilliant architects like Mies, who created a building that everybody was fascinated by and everybody knocked off, which was to the detriment of the world. But the reality was that it starts a new way of looking at the built environment, because it's so compelling, so beautiful, so innovative, so different from a lot of things that went on before. Are there any firms, any companies that have this kind of progressive idea about themselves and how they'd like to present themselves through architecture, through design, through urban development? Is there somebody you're looking at that's saying, wow, I'd love to see these ideas? No.
I have thoughts. If you look at the work of a firm like Kieran Timberlake, they've integrated, ideas about sustainability into their design work. I think there are a lot of architecture firms that have sort of wholeheartedly embraced sort of the ideas of an architecture that is more in tune with the environment, and still, sort of iconic in its in their expression of design. So the technology may not be quite as pure and elegant as it was with Seagram. However, I don't know.
Well, I just think it's like there needs to be something. Envy as part of human nature is kind of a really positive thing if you can create a movement, create an idea of an acceptance of something that is beneficial to society and beneficial to the humanity and beneficial to the earth. So I don't know. I mean, I'm grasping at straws here because you know, I love Karen Timberlake. I love the firms that do, and including you, Susanna, that do these amazing, beautiful projects that absolutely perk my brain up and give me hope. And then I look around and it's like, every city, I've been to every American city in the past 10 years, and I'm telling you, they all look the same. Every one of them. The same damn building is going up everywhere. A little change here and there, but not really. So anyway, we haven't even talked about mass transit, Mark. I mean, you have stuff on your plate that is like phenomenal. So can anybody read those questions have you seen any questions that you felt were?
There was one about mass transit. That might be a good segue from what you were just saying. Let's see, where was it? Maybe they erased it.
Let's see, is it, there's one about kind of mass transit and just like kind of decarbonization efforts across the board. And I think also looking to see who else. Similar questions.
I think the fact that our subway system has been cleaned up for the first time in 50 years because of COVID is a pretty big deal. I mean, it's not, you're not grossed out every time you go down there. So I think there's something very promising in that. Are you seeing these programs Mark talked about continued? Because I mean, they're for you know, reasonable amounts of dollars, you can get around the city very easily, and the system is built to do that. So, and everything is pretty much in place. So, how are you looking at the subway system?
So the subway system is interesting because, and this is something that is often kind of a misnomer with certain things, that the subway system is controlled by the state, right? So not by the city. And
Right.
so what that ends up meaning is that although it's a function of how New Yorkers move around and are able to utilize their city, a lot of the work you've been seeing and things that have been happening have been a result of state action over the last 8 months. It also is a result of there not being anyone riding the trains. And so the ability to do that has been a huge response to the fact that ridership has been incredibly low because people are doing the right thing and socially distancing. I guess my takeaway from that is also keep in mind New York City has, New Yorkers in general have low carbon footprints because everything is so dense and so compact, and so you're able to do a lot more in short areas. So you're not ultimately impacting the environment in the same way as if you were, in cities that are further spread out. But the lesson here, I think, is less about the notion of is the way we were doing things before like different now, and is it more a better experience? But I think unpacking like why we were doing things before. I mean, I don't know how many times this happens to you, but you take a quick breath and then you squeeze yourself into the subway before the doors close. Like there's something about this way that we've been living that I think needs to be questioned a little bit, and thinking a little bit more about like I'm all for the density and I love New York City, but I also feel as though why we were moving around in different places is something that we haven't questioned enough. And now that we're seeing the fact that we're going to have buildings having multiple uses in different ways, and the fact that we're going to have to design more adaptability and flexibility into all the spaces which we live. I mean, I'm having this conversation from my bedroom right now. That's not ideal, but it's definitely something in which it's changing our perspective on space and what value we can extract from it. And I think that there's the ability for us, now I get interrupted by little people, that's the life that I'm living. But the ability for us to then think differently about spaces and how we move between those spaces and on what means. And, you know, is it on a bike? Is it on foot? And I think all of those things are up for grabs right now. And we should be having really, I think, intentional conversations about what we want going forward, and whether or not what we were doing before was actually working for all of us.
Mhm.
So, I mean, transit also means obviously better bus systems, which certainly has improved the crosstown lanes, and they have been, and the buses have been upgraded. So, I mean, I think there's some visible sort of, you know, care that you could see there, and I mean. But one of the things that living downtown, it's been very interesting to watch how many people moved away during this pandemic. I
Mhm.
mean, and what mark are you looking at, or is your organization looking at in terms of adapting buildings that have been either fully or partially abandoned, because and there's great real estate there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that I push back a little bit on the kind of the narrative there's that cities is being emptied out, right? I know that there's definitely folks that have left, but I also feel like there's a certain privilege that comes with departing the city when things are not ideal. And I think there's a lot of folks that stuck around because they have no option but to stick around and stick it out. And I think that those are the folks that I'm concerned about. Like, I'm concerned about how do we make the city work better for them and for people that kind of live here and need to be here and need to stay here and can't necessarily just escape when it's convenient for them. And I think that for us to be able to think differently around the value that spaces are bringing to New Yorkers is what I'm really not just interested in, but I'm also compelled by. Like, this is a great, this is an opportunity for us to kind of reimagine some of the social contract of what we have between people and residents, and not just their government, but also like the physicality of their environment. And I think that we should take that seriously, and we should, be looking at ways in which we are confronting the existential challenge of climate crisis, but also simultaneously recognizing that, inequality has been rampant in a lot of the cities in which we all kind of live. And if we're not willing or able to confront it, we won't effectively be able to confront something as disruptive as climate change. I mean, we haven't been able to effectively confront COVID, and the underpinning social inequality that we've designed into a lot of our has made that incredibly more difficult, and people have died as a result. So let's take this opportunity to really tackle some of the hard things and hard choices, and see if we can kind of negotiate a better way forward.
So I agree with all of that. Is there some sign that you see that the planning community is sort of understanding that there are real needs, especially in minority communities, that need desperately to be free of all this polluted air that's spewing at them all the time, that creates all the respiratory illnesses, which then, and other illnesses, which then leads to an outsized number of deaths from COVID. I mean, we know this, we see this. What are we learning here? And how are policymakers saying, we have to do things differently and we have to spend our funds differently? Are you hearing that conversation, and what are you hearing?
Yes, we are hearing that conversation, but we've also always heard that conversation. And I think that, a lot of the communities that you kind of mentioned, poorer communities, Black and brown communities, not just in the city and other cities, have been saying this for quite some time. It's not a new story. The question is it's not even just a new story about what city governments are trying to do to fix it. It also has a lot to do with like where private sector is investing money and what things are actually coming about. Like, we can design. I was when I worked for Washington DC government for Mayor Bowser. We had a project that was a program called Government Centers, where we would basically put major city agency buildings in areas that were in need of redevelopment. So they would form a catalyst for other things to grow up around them, whether it's restaurants or support services, things like that. and that's a great kind of program in order to like incentivize development in places that could benefit from it. But you still need those other places to come. You still need other investment to follow. And I think that for a long time and consistently, that investment is not coming to the communities that can benefit the most from it. And we can incentivize it as much as we want, but I think we fundamentally, there has to be a desire. And I think talking about it now and seeing the consequences of inaction is making, I think, more people interested and more people compelled to move in a certain direction. But I do think that it's not just about the opportunities that the government are putting out there. It's about other kind of developers seeing the value add in investing in communities that will benefit from those investments. And hopefully being able to use that as the stepping stone to moving things forward.
Well, do you think
Susan, you muted yourself.
Yep, I lost sound.
Susan, I could give you a question from the Q&A.
Yeah.
I'll give you one. I'd like to hear from Mark in particular what initiatives are being taken in New York on the interaction between the built environment and transport-related decarbonization. I think you already answered that one, actually. How can we push or convince policymakers or our local representatives to vote for laws that support sustainable infrastructure?
Yeah. You know, I mean, I think we do that, but keep in mind, there are 51 city council members, for example, in New York City, and in cities all across the country, there are multiple members of councils and different ways in which local governments work. Those people respond to their communities as they should. Same thing with congressional representatives, senators. The people that live in these communities have to be invested in the outcomes, and they have to actively express that to their chosen and kind of voted representatives. So it means two things. One, the other point is that you have people like Susannah who are making great examples and projects and that are kind of rallying points for collective action. We need a lot of the other architects, planners, and designers to kind of rally around her and rally around people that are doing this type of work and make that voice a collective one. And then you need to take that voice to the representation that you've voted for, and make sure that they know that people in these communities care about these different outcomes. It also means we need to vote. And so voting is also incredibly important. And with less than 30 days to the election, I'd be remiss if I didn't remind people that it is incredibly important that you vote, not just this year, but all times, but for not just national elections, but local ones as well. Again, I won't tell you who to vote for or how you want to do that, but I will say that the voting has consequences. And I will say that a lot of the work that we've done and I've been doing over several years has been dramatically impacted by, over 100 regulations on the environment that have been repealed or defunded over the last 3.5 years. And that puts us in a very challenging and troubling place to be able to make a lot of the local decisions that impact some of the design that fits into the spaces that we've been talking about. So it's important that everyone recognizes the power of their vote and take it seriously and have a plan to vote and execute that plan. Susannah, do you think that there are, like one of the things that I think Susan was trying to say before is are there more opportunities coming out that are directing people towards projects that have higher social outcomes? And I don't know that I wonder if that's true, that's happening, that there are more indicators or more components of design projects or of projects that are kind of being pushed out to the public that have these other kind of social outcomes you're looking for. Is that a thing that is a driver? Is it a thing that you think other designers would respond more to?
Well, I'm seeing it as being as a lot more common in the professions, and it's certainly something that students in the design schools are all sort of eager to get involved with. When I was in school, it really wasn't as much of a focus, and now I think there are a lot of courses that are specifically kind of working with social aims. I think the design professions are also getting more diverse, which is helpful. It's a slow process, and hopefully that process the diversification process will accelerate. But I think that's going to help. But I do think that, you know, the embrace of strategies that were helping the environment, having those incorporated into architecture used to be kind of niche, and now it's much more mainstream. I think engineering firms are starting to embrace, this is actually addressing somebody's question too, engineering firms are starting to embrace landscape strategies, nature-based strategies, and hybrid strategies for how to design cities. I think that's a huge improvement. So that's big. And I think cities are also really trying to incorporate green standards because they realize that ultimately it helps with a bottom line. So I think there is progress happening. You know, I'd like to see more. Obviously, I'd like to see the way that we work in sync with the environment become just the prevalent way of practice. And I don't think it necessarily is now. And maybe this relates to an extent to what Susan was saying about all American cities looking alike, because they're based on technology that enables the same building to get built anywhere. And you know, we have to start thinking differently about that. You know, sort of a fundamental thing. Like if you're building in Dallas, it should look different than if you're building in Minnesota, right? You know, or, you know, that's something that I find I've been working with Marlon Blackwell on projects, and his work is just so intrinsically about the place and so incredible because of it. And I wish that all design was like that it was really of the place. And it's something that we really try to sort of accentuate in our landscape architecture design. Like I don't want a project that I do in St. Louis to look like a project I'm doing in Boulder.
Right.
So you know, there's a lot of elements, and I could just keep thinking about something my son said. He's 18. He said, you know, Mom, my generation is different. And I was thinking, well, oh, my generation, you know, and I think, you know, we've seen some change. But hopefully, you know, now there's like enough of us all feeling like we're different to actually make that change happen. So,
no, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that it's also important, I think, for a lot of people to be able to hear that there is a desire out there, and that there's more, I think, more people that are moving in this direction.
mm-hmm.
I think we're probably inclined to kind of wrap this up. I know we're getting over time. So if I see Vaso has also kind of joined us again. I don't know if you want to turn it back over, but I just one last point from my end is that, you know, I just think that it's important that we all take this incredibly seriously, the opportunity in front of us, and the opportunity for us to be able to really look at our profession and take this pause that we're existing in, where we have sirens. I'm not sure if you can hear that mine, but where we have lots of different kind of impacts to our decision making, and use that in a way in which it can be a fuel for us to be much more thoughtful, much more engaged, and much more willing to not just kind of look at the way our designs help people, but also the way our designs hurt people, and bring both of those things together to form really thoughtful outcomes that are going to be what's necessary for us to hang out as a species a little bit longer. I think it's really important. So again, I think that we might be wrapping up, but I don't know if there's anyone else on the Cooper Hewitt side that want to jump in.
I think we're still trying to unmute Susan. You might have to see on your actual screen to unmute yourself there.
There she is.
We'll be wrapping up.
Where did I go? Somebody turn me off. Anyway, the last thing that I want to say is the fact that Mark is where he is and who he is and what he knows and how he connects with the people who are in positions of making big changes in the city is really giving me, and it should give all of us, a lot of hope. The fact that Susannah is not only practicing but teaching, and her practice is really very organic and at the same time very beautiful and innovative and noticeable, is also part of the hope that I have that things can change in the next few years for the better. And the examples are powerful. The advocacy is powerful. So I wanted to thank you, both of you, for you great winners of the National Design Award, for giving us this information, and great to speak to you. And Basso, now take over, please.
Just to thank you again to everyone. I think we left the conversation today on the most important note that we can all drive change on these topics and for the future.
With design.
With design.
Yes. With design.
So thank you again, Susannah, and congratulations again. And thank you to Mark and Susan for joining us. And thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope to see you again at future programs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.